The Gospel of Mark. The real Sabbath forever. Mark 3:4. Hello. We're continuing studying in our study of Mark on chapter 3, verse 4. And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. Mark 3:4. Jesus, he was talking to them. The verse says, them. Who is that? Well, them is the religious leaders in the synagogue at the time Jesus was there and the man with the withered hand was there. Jesus asked them a question. What did he ask? Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? Mark 3:4. Is it always right to do good and to save life? Well, of course it is, yes. The law agrees with this. When we look into the Old Testament, we see what it says. The Mosaic law was given as a commandment to the Israelites. It's one of the commandments. Commandment number 4. What's it say? Observe the Sabbath day to keep it holy, as your Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your male servant or your female servant, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your male servant and your female servant may rest as well as you. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Deuteronomy 5:12 through 15. That verse, it's about keeping the Sabbath. The Sabbath, what does that mean, that word? It means rest. Previously, in our study of Mark chapter 2, what did it say? And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Mark 2:27. God, when he made the Sabbath commandment, what was it for? Well, it was for man. It was not the other way around. Did God make man for the Sabbath? No, of course not. God made the Sabbath for man. God, he made the rest for us. What was the point? Well, God wanted the Israelites to stop and remember, I brought you out of Egyptian slavery. God wanted his people to remember that he saved them from that. They could do nothing on their own without God's intervention. Let's go back to Deuteronomy now. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. Deuteronomy 5:15. That verse, we see the word therefore. What does that mean? Well, it's a connecting word from the first part to the next word. Now, what did it say? It said to keep the Sabbath. God explained why he wanted them, the people of Israel, to keep the Sabbath. He wanted first for them to rest, and secondly, he wanted them to remember that he had saved them from slavery. Let's go back to Mark 3:4. And he said to them, Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? But they were silent. Mark 3:4. Jesus, he knew the verses of the Old Testament about keeping the Sabbath, of course. God commanded no work on the Sabbath. Now, verse 4 connects that. The Old Testament, it connects it. How? Well, we need to remember that first, the covenant was made for the people of Israel, who God had saved from slavery in Egypt. And secondly, we need to remember that the new covenant was just beginning when Jesus arrived on earth. Jesus himself saved us, just as God had saved the people from slavery in Egypt. Really, the Sabbath? The Sabbath is forever. It's forever resting in Christ. That's the real Sabbath. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. Hebrews 4:1. Some of the people, they think that they will go to heaven because they are doing good. And that's not the reason. Since we all have sinned, we all have broken God's law, we all have failed. Like the Israelites, they failed. Like we fail. Do I depend on myself? No, I depend on Jesus. He is successful at keeping the law, all of the law. We rest in him, period. That's our Sabbath. The Mosaic law of the Old Testament, some people emphasize you have to follow that. They emphasize that today. If not, you're going to go to hell. Well, their teaching of the law is the opposite of resting in Christ. It's important for us to understand the spirit of the law. That's what's important, the spirit of the law. It's different from what is in the Old Testament, and we're going to discuss about that in our next devotion. Coram Deo. To live coram Deo is to live one's entire life in the presence of God, under the authority of God, to the glory of God. Everyday Breadcrumbs, Devotional Studies for the Deaf by Brad and Tammy Schaaf, taught in American Sign Language by Brad with voiceover by his wife Tammy. All verses from English Standard Version. BradDaleSchaaf@gmail.com.